My name is Joe Applegate. Can everybody in the back hear me okay? Excellent, thank you. I'm with a senior principal geologist with Geosyntec in Tallahassee. And we've got 3 great presentations today on some remedial tools to get to site closure more quickly and cost effectively. This is the 3rd and final session of the day. The first 2 sessions were jam-packed and great. We heard a lot about the challenges that our industry is facing. You know, we went from 2 years ago being in a pandemic and a pause and funding was low, record unemployment, and 2 years later, it's the opposite. We got more funding than we can spend. We got rising costs, labor shortages. Everybody I talked to is down 2 or 3 positions. So we've got a lot of challenges ahead, but good challenges to have. So more now than ever, we need to be able to focus on planning, communication, and execution. So with that, that's a good segue to today on providing additional remedial tools for our toolbox to get to site closure more quickly and cost effectively. We'll have 3 presentations, and I get to kick off and be both moderator and presenter today. And I'm going to talk about the DEP soil blending and soil management plan guidance that came out early last year, and there's been a more updated version in May of this year. We'll talk about that and some specific case examples. We also have Rick Ellis from Ivy International standing in for George Bud Ivy. I saw Bud's presentation last year on surfactant-enhanced remediation of petroleum chlorinated solvents at brownfields. So we look forward to Rick's presentation. And the 3rd presentation is from Dr. Juan Fausto Ortiz Medina. He is a research associate with EOS Remediation, and he's going to talk about stronger bacteria, faster remediation. So 3 very different types of remedial approaches, but all applicable and good tools for our tool belt. All right, so I'm going to start us off with a summary of recent guidance on soil reuse involving mixing, blending, as well as soil management plans. So this guidance actually came out in early 2021. And there's 2 guidances. One's for mixing blending activities at 62,780 sites. The second one is the guidance for preparation of soil management plans. When I first saw these, I looked at both of them, and there's a lot of redundancy and overlap between the 2. I called Brian Doherty up in Tallahassee. I said, Brian, did you really need to do 2? There seems to be a lot of overlap. And he said, well, Joe, I'm actually working on a third guidance plan. And he didn't laugh. I asked my wife, who worked with Brian for many years, and he said, Joe, he was just pulling your leg. There is no 3rd guidance. But anyway, there is a lot of overlap. I'm going to start with soil blending and probably spend less time on the soil management plan. There are public comments posted on the various versions. The most recent version of the soil reuse is from May 2022. But all the comments on the guidance documents are on DEP's website. So let's get into the soil blending guidance. Why did DEP come up with this guidance? In Florida, we're very fortunate to be able to use blending for remedial processes. Many states don't allow soil mixing, soil blending. But blending's been going on in Florida for the past 15 or 20 years. One of the first one was a Navy golf course in Orlando, right here in Orlando. It's one of the first blending projects to take place. Up until probably 3 or 4 or 5 years ago, it was kind of on an ad hoc. But because so many people are taking advantages of of blending, it was time the DEP prepare a guidance on how to do it right and make them consistent. They're more designed for large tracts, agricultural lands, like Wilbur talked about this morning, golf courses and so forth, where you're dealing a lot with pesticides, herbicides, and other COCs. The soil reuse includes blending and placement within the contaminated site itself. Everything has to be done within the site. The guidance provides consistency in soil blending, and I'm going to give you a couple of examples of how we've implemented soil blending on a couple of sites as we go forward. All right, what is soil reuse? Well, it's blending of soil with exceedances of direct exposure SCTLs or other applicable SCTLs. And one of the large parts of this guidance is that in the past, a lot of blending processes focused on sampling stockpiles after the soil's been blended. This is different. DEP wants you to do confirmatory sampling on placed materials after it's been blended, not stockpile sampling. That second bullet there is basically meeting those SCTLs on the placed material. Typically, you're dealing with contamination on-site, but the rule does allow you, if you have off-site contamination, to blend in those off-site areas as well. And then post-placement verification sampling is required to make sure you're compliant with the SCTLs. So, site-specific factors to be considered for soil reuse blending. An accurate data set for soil and groundwater assessments really needed to get a concentration and distribution of COCs. For example, golf courses are typically 75 to 100 acres. That seemed like a lot of soil sampling. But we're able to go out and collect hundreds of soil samples for arsenic and OCPs in about a matter of a week. So you really have a pretty good handle on what your concentration and distribution of COCs are in order to determine if soil blending is going to be right for that site. You got to look at the soil types, make sure it's amenable to blending. You know, if you got a real clayey soil, that might be an issue, as well as looking at your leachability potential. Another important factor is site closure goals. I was talking to Wilbur about his presentation this morning afterwards, and it's kind of critical when you're blending because you typically don't blend more than a ratio of 3 clean to 1 dirty. And if your cleanup goals are 2.1 for arsenic, you really can't be over 6 ppm of arsenic in your soil and blend it down to 2.1. It makes a big difference. If you have concentrations higher than 6 or 8 ppm, those are probably going to have to come off. You have to excavate those point sources. Also, if you can, there are ways to get alternate cleanup target levels. DEP came out with a paper not too long ago about retirement facilities. And some of the exposure assumptions are a little bit different for older communities. So if you use their guidance, you can come up with about a 3.4 ppm cleanup target level for arsenic. That doesn't sound like a lot, 2.1 to 3.4, but when you're blending 6 or 7 ppm down to 2, it makes a big difference. So if there are ways you can develop alternate cleanup target levels, it will help your soil blending quite a bit. Guidance recommends proposed soil blending procedures to be incorporated into a remedial action plan or an ISRP or a soil management plan. Blending is not really applicable for sites with widespread contamination like RECA listed sites, PCBs, and other hazardous waste. So You got to have the right set of contaminants at the right concentrations for this to make sense. So more soil reuse considerations. I've talked about the blending ratios and calculations, so you really got to look at your concentrations and distributions to make sure blending is good for your site. Both the soil management plan and the blending guidance talks a lot about how you're going to move dirt around. These large acres has a lot of soil moving during redevelopment. So you don't not only have to worry about the environmental assessment and remedial plan, but you have to weave that into the site plan and what the final distribution of all the material that you're blending, where that's going to end up. And that's the material you're going to have to demonstrate with your confirmatory sampling as far as meeting SCTLs. Stockpiles, the main thing is you need to put them on impervious surfaces to prevent leachate infiltration. If you don't store it on something impervious, you might have to go back to that area after you remove the stockpile and make sure you didn't contaminate the soil underneath where you were storing the stockpiles. There's all kinds of language about securing stockpiles to prevent human exposure, runoff, air exposures and things like that. But your soil blending does trigger the soil management plan. So if you're doing blending, you have to follow both guidance documents. Important things to consider about verification sampling after you've blended and go out to do your verification sampling. You may sample in the 0 to 2 foot interval. Typically for 780, you have to, your SAR has to have intervals from 0 to 0.5, 0.5 to 2 feet. But once you've blended and you're blending across that whole 2 feet, confirmatory samples can be composited over to 2 feet. The exception is if you've got VOCs, which typically aren't used in blending sites, point samples are not allowed. Composite samples aren't allowed. So, DEP does allow use of incremental sampling methodologies, which was developed several years ago. Your confirmatory sampling plans are supposed to incorporate a 1/4 acre exposure unit. So that would mean if you've got 40 acres of blending, you're going to have to do 4 samples per acre, so you're going to have 160 samples across that size. That's a lot of samples. If you had a lot of different COCs, that would be very expensive. We have been successful in getting larger EU sizes on the order of an acre, acre and a half. When you consider you're collecting hundreds of samples during the site assessment, DEP will allow you to increase that 1/4 acre exposure unit for your confirmatory sampling. A declaration of restrictive covenant may be needed to prevent future subdivision of the EU, and 95% UCL may be used to obtain average concentrations, but not required for determining number of samples per the decision unit. So you'll go out, and the confirmatory sampling plan is usually put in your RAP and your soil management plan. So once you've conducted the verification sampling, you're probably going to have areas that exceed your SCTLs. You're going to have to go out and reblend those areas until you can demonstrate you've blended everything down below your cleanup target level. There is an alternative to the verification sampling. I don't know that anybody that's done this yet. There's a white paper that UF prepared back in December 2020. You can use stockpile sampling if you use incremental sampling for your stockpile. So I haven't heard of anybody implementing that yet, but that might be a way to save having to go do all your confirmatory sampling down the road. There's the white paper. And that is on the DEP website. I'm quickly going to go through the SMP, the Soil Management Plan. The purpose of this was to provide a comprehensive document to address all contaminated soil management activities. Basically, how you're going to manage the soil on site and not make things worse with runoff, exposures to workers. And this SMP can be a standalone document depending on what kind of site you have, or it can be a section of your remedial action plan. So tips for success, get your ducks in a row on your data set. Many of these sites are associated with redevelopment plans. A good example, we started working on a golf course redevelopment that's going residential in Central Florida earlier this year. Started collecting data in February. We had a SAR drafted by May, June. We got on the phone with DEP probably in April to let them know this was coming. That last bullet is engage DEP early and often to reduce uncertainty, make sure you don't have data gaps. We've been preparing a lot of these blending documents in a combined SAR wrap to accelerate it because development schedules are typically accelerated. So we've gone from a SAR wrap, and we just got wrap approval on this site last week, all in about 7 or 8 months. So you can do it under those aggressive schedules, but the key is communicating with DEP. The districts and Tallahassee are both involved with the review of those documents and are very helpful. But you have to plan meetings and engage DEP early on. Some of the SMP elements, background, basically the number of properties that are involved, land uses before and after. You can see some of the development plans over examples to the right. Depict source areas, your blending areas, define exposure units. That photo or that graphic on the bottom right shows, and this is often the case, especially on golf courses where your greens and tees are usually much higher. They have to be excavated, and the fairways and surrounding areas are blended. So the pink areas are blending areas, and the yellow and orange are excavation areas. I think I covered a lot of this already. You got to identify your COCs, your target SCTLs, or your justification of alternate site cleanup target levels. And if you're developing that, that can be, it's usually better to do that before you do your SAR wrap, so you got your cleanup target level clearly identified before you move into the final SAR wrap. You got to make sure you've completed soil delineation for the entire site. If you do an ASCTL on site, you got to still make sure you meet residential at the perimeter. So typically these plans have soil sampling all around the perimeter to make sure you've got residential, below residential along the property boundary. And while we do use XRF's a great tool to have in the field. You can get detection limits down to 1 ppm for arsenic. We still rely on fixed-based laboratory data when we're defining extents and depths of contamination. These are more elements for contaminated soil excavation. We work very closely with the developers. As I said, a lot of dirt is moving around, so you have to weave their development plans into your remedial action plan, soil management plan. So it takes a lot of coordination with the developer and their engineers on what their final plans are going to be, and kind of how the work is going to proceed during the redevelopment. So we're looking at our cut lines congruent with their development, identifying our stockpile approaches, estimating volumes, so on and so forth. Another important thing is to, if you are blending, for example, you need to make sure you have clean backfill. Even backfill that has 1 or 1.5 ppm, if you're blending 6 and you start with 2, you're not going to meet 2.1. So it's really important to either identify clean soil on site that's non-detect, preferentially or preferably, and that it's below SCTLs. And the final elements of the soil management plan, you need to describe the final cover material, and if you have proposed engineering controls, what those are. If you're doing construction dewatering, if you're proposing institutional controls, what type they are and where are they being placed on the site, as well as contingency plans for air monitoring and dust control and mitigation. The soil management plan is a pretty dry document, so I wouldn't review that if you need to stay awake. So that's all I had. I did want to mention we're going to take questions after each presentation. So I have time for any questions people might have on soil blending. Got a person right there with a question. We probably need a microphone.
You mentioned that you previously got like acre and a half units approved for verification sampling.
For confirmatory sampling?
Yeah. On what basis, like, did you get that approved?
We basically negotiated that with the EP based on the number of soil samples that we collected during the site assessment in combination with our density. And we were able to get an acre and 1.25 acre density for our confirmatory sampling. Our latest one, they've given us a little pushback, so we're still in negotiations with that.
Yeah.
So have you experienced pushback on that?
Yeah, we've experienced a lot of pushback on that. So that what you said was actually the largest we've heard of getting approved. So,
I mean, if it's just arsenic, 1 per quarter acre is not a whole lot because arsenic's $15 a sample. So if you have to do 160 versus 40, it's not a lot of money. But if you start dealing with OCPs where you're spending 150, 200 bucks a sample, it can be a lot of money.
yeah, we haven't really done blending with OCPs, so I guess that makes sense. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Corinne. And how many out there have implemented blending programs on some of your projects? Wow, there's quite a few. Have you all, the original guidance didn't have the quarter acre decision unit in there for confirmatory sampling. They added that in the last revision. So have most of you all that have been doing blending and confirmatory sampling been required to use quarter acre decision unit? Or have you gotten higher? Higher?
Half acre.
Oh, half acre? Well, that helps too. Donna?
Yeah. So have you, all your confirmation samples graph samples, or have you used ISAM?
We've been using discrete sampling. The risk of using ISM, and say, for example, you're on a golf course and you decide that your ISM decision unit's a hole, okay? If you do 30 increments across that decision unit and you come up above your cleanup target level, you've got to go back and blend the whole hole. Versus if you do discrete sampling and say 90% of your discrete samples pass, you only have to go back to 10% and reblend, right? But if you have a big decision unit and you exceed the whole, you have to go back and do the whole thing. So that's why we haven't done it for the confirmatory sampling. So, good question, really good question.
Joe, just for clarification, is the sample from 0 to 2 feet, is it a composite?
Yes, it is. And people are blending different ways. We're using a unit that will do a very nice uniform, it's not a plow, but it's a blending implement. And you can do about 3 acres a day. but it blends down to 22, 24 inches, and it gives you a very nice uniform blend.
And then when you take your sample, it's a composite.
Yeah, we'll take a 0 to 2 foot, composite that across the whole interval, and DEP is okay with that. Because they're assuming that's uniformly blended across the whole 2 feet.
So your 0 to 2 is because that's the size, that's the depth your equipment goes, correct? Because we blend with 18, I think typically, and we would do a 0 to 18 inches for our verification.
Yeah, we've been blending in place with that implement, and it goes to 24 inches, yeah. Lorna?
You mentioned that there are circumstances when off-site reuse of the spended soil is allowed. Can you expound on that a little bit?
I had that question because that particular site was not mine, it was Ryan's, and I called him right before. And he said the last one they did, they actually ran into some off-site arsenic contamination during the blending process when they were doing testing. And they were allowed to delineate that off-site portion on an adjacent property and continue blending off-site. So they didn't, I asked if they brought it back on-site, and no, they just blended it off-site.
So I'm assuming the off-site property had the same former use and.
Yes. Yep. All good questions. Wow. Very good. Well, we'll move on.